Thank you, Tony, for a lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming. So today I'm going to talk about healthy mamas making healthy babies and the intergenerational transmission of risk and resilience. And so I did kind of a bit of reflection in preparing for this talk, thinking about like the themes that the other faculty members did during the week, like who am I? Questions about, who do I want to be? And it's a little overwhelming to think about like the whirlwind of the last 2.5 years of all the things I've been doing and been involved with and all of the relationships I've made, but then simultaneously overwhelming about all the things I haven't completed or the accomplishments on the list that haven't been gotten to. And so that's really that bittersweet that runs through life and everything. And in terms of this talk, I really realized it's not so much who am I, but who do I want people and like you all to think I am? Who do I want you to think I am? And so I did get a lot of advice on the talk, some of which was like, just do your job talk, no one will remember. But the best advice was to talk about what you want to talk about. What do you enjoy? What do you like? And what do you want people to think about when they think about you? So I'm going to give a brief intro about how I think about the world and how that shapes my research. I want to talk about the thing I'm most proud of that brings meaning to my work. And I want to talk about new projects that I'm excited about. If that doesn't hit an hour, then maybe I'll talk about some of the work that helped me get there. But we'll see. So as a psychologist, like a lot of us, I'm in the business of relationships, observing these relationships, understanding the relationships, changing those relationships. And I want to understand the connections that makes us who we are, for better or for worse. And so this is my favorite relationship. Why? Well, babies are adorable, obviously, and babies also really like me a lot. I got a good connection going with little infants. I read them pretty well. But babies really give us a lot to hope for. They are a little bit of like a symbol of the future. They are hope, they are change, they are potential, and everything that could happen. But importantly, and like it or not, babies carry with them memories of the past. And this shapes their ability to adapt and to survive. And ultimately, this is what I'm interested in. How memories of survival, of trauma, of the transmission of culture, of poverty, of mental and physical health gets transmitted over time, from one generation to the next generation. As I was preparing for this talk, I came across this picture, and I don't know if you can read it, but it says, when you are pregnant, you are also pregnant with your grandchild. And so if you're a woman who's having a baby that's a girl, that fetus already has all of its gametes for the next generation. You're born with all of your next generation's sex cells. And so even though like I think about this stuff a lot, seeing that picture, never really thought about it like that. It was really like my mind was a little bit blown. That before we're even faint whisper of an idea, our existence, half of our existence at least, is already being shaped. The other reason that I'm drawn to that relationship and this perinatal period more broadly, so pregnancy and postpartum, is that it's a period of development that a lot happens, right? There's a lot of changes, relationships are taking shape, and this really 2 years, you go from not here to potentially walking around, babbling, getting into trouble, being a cutie, right? A lot happens. And what is really amazing is that even as soon as we're born and through up to age 5, so infants we consider through age 5, almost like 90% of their brain is there. It's like set. That is what we've got. And the first 3 years, every second, like 1 million connections are being made. So as soon as that baby opens his or her eyes, hears things, feels the blanket on their shoulder, feels like wind in their face, their system is like forming new connections and trying to figure out how to understand the world. And importantly, this really makes for a foundations, right? So that this first year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years sets this foundation. And it might be a really sturdy, hardy foundation, or it might be more fragile and wrought with difficulties. And importantly, this doesn't happen in isolation. It happens as part of a relationship. And so sometimes I recite this quote in my team, like there's no such thing as a baby, right? A baby alone does not exist. What exists is a couple. A baby plus someone that takes care of him or her. Babies depend 100% on their caregiver for survival. From that moment that they're born, they may even depend on that caregiver for regulating their temperature, helping them to breathe potentially, that there are regulatory capacities in addition to the social, emotional, and learning and cognitive capacities. And so this primary caregiving relationship is the main context in which babies develop and in which they live. And what helps me is that it's the most contained any one of our lives might ever be, right? Thinking about a baby being born, we've got that baby within a context. And for at least a bit of time, its primary context is that primary caregiver relationship. I talk a lot about moms. Moms happen to be the primary caregivers to most of our babies. And that relationship then, although it's still working in these other systems, so things even at the policy level of family leave, of health care, of things like appropriate child care, all those policies are going to shape this infant's context and is going to shape how this caregiver, this mom, is able to provide this baby with the best nurturance and stimulation and just overall care that it can. And so we are who we are in relation to our context. And we also adapt to our context. So within these dynamic contexts, we are constantly adapting. So Dr. Bert Craven gave us a really nice overview last week about biological adaptation, particularly in the relation to the stress response. Our bodies adapt physiologically, and there are great implications for development, particularly in terms of our brain development. There's also behavioral adaptation. So how we react and respond to the world is continuously shaped within these contexts. And all of this is really occurring for survival. Unfortunately, things can go a little haywire when we find ourselves in the environment that was not really forecasted to be. That if our environment that we find ourselves was not what our body had expected when we were born, that is a mismatch that is contributing to our health and our development and to our morbidity. And the way we adapt to these contexts is influencing our health development trajectories. So that the effects or the outcomes associated with our trajectories are coming from the interplay of context by the way of life experiences, and also intrinsic factors by the way of our biopsychological, cognitive, behavioral adaptations. Some of these effects are going to be more acute and happening in the moment to guide our trajectories. So something like a sudden loss or injury, having a natural disaster hit your community, that our trajectories in the moment and acutely can be sort of thrown off. Other effects and outcomes might be latent. So they may not potentially be obvious until later in life when something about their context now changes, and that underlying vulnerability is going to play a role. And so overall, these effects, both the latent and the acute, will accumulate over time and interact with each other to give you like this overall complete model. And so this is, really how I think about, how children develop. So this dynamic system that is varying over time and has feedback loops, so that wherever I am is going to feed back, because now my context, it's going to change how I interact with my context, it's going to change how I might adapt to that context, and so on through all the stages of our life. That affects so this model then, in all of its complicated and messy glory, is how I see things. So every kid that is coming through the clinic, every student that's struggling in one of my classes, every research participant that I might meet, in one of my projects, I'm really dying to know, how did they get to this place? And what can I do to help them out at the moment? And ideally, what can I do to try to prevent that or change the trajectory enough so that it doesn't contribute to further difficulty? And so this model really helps me to understand child and maternal health. And one of the areas in which these processes are really obvious, and it's more like salient and stark, is the area of maternal and infant mortality. So this part gets a little depressing. Nobody likes it when people are dying, but it's super salient, You're either alive or you're not alive. And trying to figure out what got us to that place makes that outcome a little more clear, It's not as messy as a score on a depression scale. It is really alive or not alive. Okay. And so this is getting to that second point, the work I'm most proud of to date. So here is a lovely graph that my lovely students helped me to make. And this dark line in the middle here is the U.S. Infant mortality rate. All infants 0 to 5 with any cause. This is all causes. All these others are the other countries, So living and being born in Iceland, good time, good to go. Hardly any infants just die, Japan is doing pretty good, Finland, Sweden. Italy starting to etch up there, not so hot, but we are, been consistently under 10%, and this has not gone up recently, which is nice, but it hasn't declined as quickly as it has over time. The rate has not declined. What is really important about this graph are these dotted lines. These are the U.S. infant mortality rates by race. So this line are our Black and African American mothers. This top one. This line are our Native American and Alaskan Native mothers. This straight line here are our U.S. white mothers. And then we've got Hispanic mothers is sort of lower line here, and then I can't really see, oh yeah, and then Asian mothers. Does everybody see that? See it okay? So we've got a big, problem that these numbers are really providing this unsettling snapshot of a crisis that already is a crisis around just U.S. infants as a whole, but that these national trends are really masking variability according to who we are. Black African Americans and Native Americans are carrying a disproportionate and excessive burden of morbidity and mortality relative to all the other groups. And their rates are closer to countries like Libya or Brazil, and are more in line with the rates for the US on average during the 1930s, when healthcare was pretty different. It doesn't really get much better. In fact, it's really more alarming for maternal morbidity, right? So this line is a US line again, and since 1990, it's increased. Moms have been dying 17% more today compared to 1990. So they're dying more often during childbirth. And again, we see that this is variable according to our racial groups in the United States, with Black mamas up here and our Native American mamas here. And so it is alarming, to say the least. And in trying to understand how to think about healthy mamas and healthy babies, it's really important to look at these differences, because they're telling us something, that this is something that is a significant public health crisis that is shaping the United States. So, our Black and brown mamas and babies matter, and they're getting forgotten in a lot of our hospitals and a lot of our communities. And why? Why are the mortality rates so high for these women and their babies? And so things that are contributing, and the things that are related to the greatest racial disparities, include being born at a low birth weight, being born small for gestational age, which is often associated with an intrauterine growth restriction, being born too early, being injured during birth, and all of these infant outcomes are really closely linked with a lot of maternal health outcomes. So hypertensive disorders, blood pressure during pregnancy, cardiovascular disease, and hemorrhage. And after you give birth and maybe you survive all of that, the risks are now, our developmental trajectory has now shifted again, and the long-term outcomes are now more negative. And so this table is just looking at infant mortality by our two main causes that infants die. So infants born preterm are defined as being born less than 37 weeks during gestation, and babies that are low birth weight are smaller than 2,500 grams, which is less than 4-ish kind of pounds. And those two factors contribute to major health complications, including death, respiratory problems, GI problems, feeding problems, long-term neurological and developmental disabilities. So preterm infants are born before several major organ groups are done developing. And extremely preterm infants, which are born before 28 weeks, so 28 out of 40, they're just slightly over halfway there, have outrageously high risk for lifelong morbidity and disabilities. And like I mentioned, these two birth outcomes are really closely linked to maternal health complications during pregnancy. So things like high blood pressure at the more severe end with preeclampsia, but even just high blood pressure, that the actual length of time that your blood pressure is too high is associated with greater and greater morbidity for your baby. And that is in part tied to how blood is transferred through the placenta and contributes to now that infant not getting enough nutrients, not getting enough oxygen. And you can't grow well without those things. And so you're starting out now at a disadvantage from all these other babies. And so in 2015, the preterm rate in the US increased for the first time in like 8 years. It went up, not a ton, but it went up. And that trend has continued through 2016 and 17, I don't know about 18. And it is about 1 in 10 babies, which is kind of a lot of babies, right? 1 in 10. And together, preterm labor and low birth weight account for 1 in 6 stillbirths, 1 in 4 neonatal deaths. So that's during like the first few weeks after being born. And those babies, those rates are 35% higher among American Indians and Alaska Natives, and a striking 232% higher among Black babies. And so getting to moms, so we have like a whole table that has all of these complications, and these are our bigger ones. And so we've got a mortality rate of death, so 1.29 in 100,000 is the rate, and the ratio is the comparison between our racial groups, so Black Americans versus white Americans. So we've got a ratio of more than 5 times and more than 2 times for hypertensive disorders among our Black and Native American mamas. And so hypertension or high blood pressure is one of the most common medical problems, complicating almost 10% of pregnancies, and they include like a whole slew of disorders. So there's chronic hypertension, so you might have already had high blood pressure before you got pregnant. Having gestational hypertension, so once you're pregnant, developing hypertension, preeclampsia, so having high blood pressure plus other complications like protein in your urine and potential organ dysfunction. And eclampsia is a symptom of neurological, so having seizures or organ shutdown related to preeclampsia. And then you can also have superimposed hypertension. So you already had hypertension, and now it got way worse that you are pregnant. And there's also HELP syndrome. So your red blood cells are getting destroyed, your liver enzymes are not looking good, you have low platelets. All of these things are super bad. Like, this is a medical emergency, and doctors weigh whether to deliver the baby, because the symptoms are, like, the acute symptoms will lessen once the baby is delivered. And so we're trying to weigh how long we can let this mom live before this basically kills them both. But we don't want that baby to be born too early, because I just told you about the problem with being born too early. So they're making a decision, and a lot of women end up, waiting and laying in the hospital for weeks or months on bed rest, trying to keep that baby in there as long as they can without getting too sick. And so medical interventions associated with hypertension are super high. And they include C-sections, blood transfusions, hysterectomies, placental abruptions, when your placenta like rips out of your uterus. Nothing is good. It also contributes to subsequent cardiovascular disease. So this one heart disease, cardiomyopathy, occurs during the postpartum, and it's like one of the only heart conditions, I mean, you can get it, other people can get it, but you see it rarely, but you see it a lot in pregnant and postpartum women, and it's your heart is getting big and pumping like crazy, but nothing is sort of happening, right? Your heart is too big and it's not efficient, and since it's kind of rare, we don't really notice it. Moms go home, and at 6 weeks, we might bring them back and ask them how they're doing, but their complaints are like, oh, I'm so tired. I can't really breathe that good. And they get things like, oh, you gotta exercise more. Oh, you gotta lose some weight, because that is what's contributing to it. And they get missed that they have this heart, their heart is failing slowly, and they will like essentially sort of drown because no oxygen is getting to their brain. And so these are all huge complications. And, oops, sorry. Of course, all of these issues are happening at a disproportionate rate among racial minority groups. So, with that all said, and long-term morbidity is no good, right? So after you give the baby and the baby's born, you're doing fine, you recover, you no longer have preeclampsia, your risks of chronic hypertension, of cardiovascular disease like stroke and heart attack and death is increased by kind of a lot. And cardiovascular disease is one of our biggest killers, and that also is disproportionately distributed amongst the population. And also, which getting to, related to the preterm birth and the low birth weight and our intergenerational transmission of health, right, our developmental origins of health and disease, babies born too early to a mom that has preeclampsia are at a much increased risk for their own cardiovascular disease and hypertension later on in life. And so, what do you think is contributing to that? Genetics, let's see. The hunt for heritability has turned up very little, right? So simply because a condition's heritable doesn't mean it is attributable to genetics. It's really, there are certain kinds of diseases like Tay-Sachs disease or sickle cell anemia that are fairly rare in society and can be linked to a single gene. They've been looking, believe me, for a gene for cardiovascular disease. Can't find it. It's unlikely for such a common disease across the population to, for any given individual to really inherit some complex array that causes them to have that problem. And there are studies on secular changes in disease phenotypes. So these guys studied immigrant women. So sometimes people might talk about our immigrant paradox of people that are moving to this country are healthier. They got healthy babies, they got good birth weight. In the span of a single generation, those babies are now more in line with the risks associated with their racial group. One generation of living in the United States. So it's likely not some genetic factor that differentiates black people from white people, from Native American people and Asian people. What might be another thing? Sorry. Poverty. So individuals in lower social classes definitely have greater morbidity and mortality, right? Our health, people that are poor have worse health than people that are not poor. And it is true that people in poverty experience unequal access to health care and education. They have a disproportionate exposure to health hazards and like inadequate housing, improper nutrition. But what's interesting is that social class and race in the US is intrinsically linked. So that race is correlated with almost all socially relevant environmental factors that contribute to variations in health risk. What is super that I didn't know before I was working on this was that the United States has not actually collected socioeconomic data in its national data sets. Why? Because of one, deeply held convictions about social mobility in the United States, and two, because for much of the history of the United States, class was defined by race and racial subordination. So that we didn't need to collect data on how much money people make because there was an ingrained hierarchy. And so in the limited research that examines health outcomes by both race and class, the disparities don't amount to just social class. And there is an independent effect of race beyond the overrepresentation in lower socioeconomic classes. So non-Hispanic Black infants have adverse birth outcomes at rates 1.5 to 3 times higher than white infants at every level of socioeconomic status. So we've got moms that report a high school or lower, a college and some degree, and then a graduate degree. So that our moms with graduate degrees who are Black or who are Native are doing worse than even our white moms in high school, right? So although they're doing better than Black moms or Native moms that only have a high school degree, it is not protective to suggest that all of those risk factors are because they're poor or because they're in the lower socioeconomic classes. So this might reflect additional socioeconomic factors that we don't capture in something like education. So something, lower wealth accumulation over time, or other unmeasured social factors that are unique to racial minorities. So what might that be? Discrimination. So that classifying being Black or being Native as a risk factor is obscuring this complexity about the risk of health disparities. And thinking about race itself as some risk factor makes it so that we are not effective at preventing morbidity or mortality, right? We're attributing it to something that isn't the reason, right? And so racism, whether interpersonally mediated or institutionalized, it's a potent psychosocial risk factor with significant implications for health. It is chronic, it's unyielding, it's uncontrollable, and it has been associated with that biological adaptation piece. So that over time, this is one of those chronic stressors, one of our contextual factors that contributes to our allostatic load, so that we have to adapt. We're constantly stressed over time. And that dysregulation, like Dr. Berg-Craven told us about, really disrupts a whole lot of functions in our health, in our bodies. And Geronimus talks about it as weathering, but essentially the allostatic load, this rapid aging of cells, premature aging, that we can associate with discrimination and race. And high inflammation is, we just talked about high blood pressure and heart disease, and everybody's like, oh yeah, inflammation. Everybody has high inflammation. They test inflammation. Misty's study looks at inflammatory markers, right? They have a huge implications for pregnancy and birth outcomes. And so this is sort of, what it looks like. Here we have a nice mom, and if she's overly stressed, she's got preeclampsia, that has direct impact on fetal growth and placental growth, so that our babies might be born too small, and some of them might be born too big. And this is that fetal programming, this developmental origins of health and disease. So that now, these babies are, their physiological adaptation is adapted to an environment that may or may not be well forecasted for what life's going to be like later. And so this is, and I feel like I should have put these pictures earlier, being born at 35 weeks, your brain is more like this. It doesn't have as many ridges or grooves, just a mere 5 weeks longer. You've got a whole crap load of synapses that are now being developed, right? Like, that brain looks way better than the other brain with just like a mere 5 weeks. And so we don't want our babies being born early. And so some evidence for this, right? In the 6 months following 9/11, women of Arab descent in California were more likely to give birth to a low birth weight or preterm baby than in the prior 6 months. And that increase was not seen among anybody else. In Pottsville, Iowa, in the 37 weeks following a big raid that totally took half of the population of Pottsville, Iowa, and deported half of the people, birth weights dropped. And only amongst groups of Hispanic women, right? And it's not that people are following them around, right? Like, people might be following them around. Some people might have interpersonally, directly, overtly mediated discrimination, but having this vicarious racism, right? The racial profiling or harassment that someone sees another person from their group experiencing now heightens their own fear of being targeted. Thinking, should people go to Shabbat tomorrow, right? Thinking about people am I going to be targeted for who I am, even though I might not be actively receiving discrimination or threats. But the threat is there, and it's uncontrollable, and it's unknowable, and it's pervasive. And so that really, getting back to this, makes our community and the policies, it puts a lot of pressure on families to keep kids safe. Families don't think they can keep kids safe. And they may have already inherited some biological adaptations that are important for survival, right? That these biological adaptations of being hypervigilant, of being kind of on edge, keep you from getting eaten or attacked by something, right? But if you never know when it's going to happen, it always stays up. And that context then is interacting with your biology to shape your health trajectory. And so this life course perspective is integrating that idea of allostatic loading with earlier fetal programming to describe birth outcomes and to help explain early outcomes for infants and children. That disruptions in that intrauterine environment, which is your context, is now inducing sometimes permanent change in how your body is functioning. And so this is like an example of like how that kind of works. This is another sweet image of how that works. So this nice lady over here, super stressed, having problems. She probably is working up until the day she delivers, right? Her baby now is adapting to this stressful environment and is now at risk, right? And the actual health outcomes, in part, some of them are going to depend on their own life experiences now. And that keeps going on. And so sometimes the extent of the physiological programming depends on the conditions of the developmental environment. So it might result in maybe some phenotypic variability that's subtle or more mild and doesn't actually become observed unless they're put into more extreme postnatal environments. So that's like on one end. The other end is we can have like really bad defects like from the get-go. And so pregnancy now, that perinatal period, becomes your greatest stress test. It extensively puts your body into this like messed up state where you make more blood, you have way too much blood in your body, and you're like, if you look at this poor lady here, she doesn't look comfortable right here at all. This is like the most awesome thing I found, if I could go to it, that basically shows you how your body changes during pregnancy across the weeks. So 1 to 4 weeks, 5 to 8 weeks, getting a little, maybe you could see my bump. I don't know. I'm feeling good. I don't know about this. Look at my stomach. My stomach's getting smashed. Oh God, that placenta now is there. It's pushing on my heart. There's like way too much blood. Oh, my back. How am I going to carry this? It's smashing my bladder. Right? It's like amazing, right? That anybody can do this. And then it just all goes, back, but not in the same place necessarily. But like, it's close. Right? So that you got this lady. So for these women that they've been healthy and then they get pregnant and suddenly they've got high blood pressure and suddenly they have diabetes and suddenly they're having these adverse birth outcomes that they didn't know they were at risk for. It helps explain that increased risk for the long-term morbidity post-pregnancy, because the variation, what you inherited, that phenotypic physiological sensitivity, is now put in the most extreme possible stress test, so it comes out. This is the same thing, right? The differential exposure to stressors is a key factor underlying processes of physiological adaptation and differential health trajectories. And this differential exposure to health by race occurs as a function of racism, is the theory. And so present day manifestations may be passed down generationally through processes of adaptation, cumulative chronic stress exposure. And like I said earlier, these Race minorities are disproportionately represented among our groups with risks for socially relevant environmental factors like poverty, like poor nutrition, like exposure to bad environmental things. And once that baby's born, that structural inequality is also passed down through policies and laws and customs that reflect the historical legacy of racial subordination in the country, and is exacerbating these health disparities. So there's not equal access to health care, including prenatal care. So, let's just get everybody better prenatal care. Well, it doesn't really work like that, because you're operating under the assumption that healthcare is equal for everybody. If we go to the doctor, this same doctor is going to treat me the same as somebody else. And that has been found to not be accurate. And this idea of this dual health system, right? So historically there's been this notion of a dual health system related to slavery. They had their own health system, and it wasn't as good. Unequal health system. We just had Chris Forer here and speak to us about IHS. That also we can think about as a dual and unequal health system. It is mandated to provide health care for Native Americans, and ultimately it comes out to about $3,000 per patient. And he was very fixed on talking to us about how to save every dollar, that most of their operating costs go towards health care, actual health care. Because he doesn't have much to work with. That's not a lot. Okay, so what about Medicare? Whoa, old people are getting quite a bit more money to take care of their health, right? Okay, well, so maybe this is something to do with poverty again. So we'll look, at Medicaid. No, Medicaid's getting quite a bit more money per person to treat health costs. This one actually blew my mind. I should have gotten that emoji again. But the Federal Bureau of Prisons spends $8,000 on patient care. And I'm not saying they shouldn't get patient care. They most certainly should. But if we're trying to understand racial disparities, it's understanding that the systems themselves are unequal and unfair. And so because I am not a member of these groups and really try to demonstrate humility around issues that I care a lot about, but I recognize don't directly affect me, I felt it's important to listen to people's own words. And so, these are statements in various news articles and journal articles talking about healthcare or the experience of racism. And so racial injustice lies not only in the facts and your statistics, but in the thick of everyday life, things that you can't capture. I realized that the psychological weight of 3 generations of Black women lives in my womb. It got denied. My follow-up got denied. The hospital didn't even ask if I was willing to pay. They would assume that other non-Indians would pay for it themselves. Why do we as Indian people not get to make those decisions ourselves? I felt brushed off and did not know what to do. It was not until I told one of my fellow residents about the pain I was experiencing that I went into my own ER where I worked and received a CAT scan that diagnosed my life-threatening brain bleed. You learn to go last. No matter how much people talk about it, it's the same. Yes, it is. It's been like that forever. That's how it is. And we hear people like Serena Williams talking about their health care that knowing something is wrong, knowing that I have a history of embolism, knowing that I don't feel right, and being brushed off. So that when they finally do listen to her, it turns out she's got 2 embolisms in her legs. She could have, at the worst, died, at the best, lost her legs. Serena Williams, right? She's not poor. She's not uneducated, right? So that it's there and is compounded and is something that then becomes important to understanding all maternal and child health, is to understand how it differs across the people in our own country. And so that leads to current projects that follow along this theme. So slumber, we worked really hard on all our logos and like words, right? And so this is funded by Circa, and it's looking at ACEs, and so this graded response, I'm sure everybody knows what ACEs are. I was also interested in ACEs that aren't captured in the 10, but are in the community environments, things like discrimination, things like poor housing or violence in the community as opposed to one's family. And similar to this triangle gives us an idea of how these adverse childhood experiences disrupt development, change our functioning and behavior to lead to morbidity and poor health outcomes. And so it is really missing something. So I felt like it was missing something. So that even before you're born, there are conditions, social conditions that you're now being born into that we just talked about related to fetal programming that might play a big role before anybody maltreats you. And so that was something as part of these studies that we wanted to know more about. Here in Oklahoma, this number is actually better than I thought it was, because I think we used to be in 2014 50 out of 50. Now maybe we got a little better, I don't know why. But we're not doing so great as far as our kids being exposed to adverse childhood experiences. And so we did a study with OSU students. Here's our Oklahoma, and here are our students here in our academic community. So 0 ACEs is starting here. And then we've got 1 ACE, 2 ACE, 3 ACE, and then 4 or more. 28% is huge for our student population. And it sort of breaks down in this way, but what is more interesting are the frequency of the kinds of ACEs that are experiencing. So we got a lot of divorce, living with an alcoholic or drug user, having a family member who has a mental illness, being emotionally abused, never feeling loved or special. So that's one of those additional community level ACEs that we added. Family did not feel close or support each other. Difficulty getting a job due to discrimination. Directly being removed from one's family. This is also one of those additional ACEs, so being in foster care. So our community is kind of dealing with a lot. And this is, these are measures of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. I don't know about this PTSD measure. I mean, we just made these graphs, so this is like a preview, but that's kind of a lot of PTSD symptoms, right? Which might be hyperarousal, being more on edge that isn't quite captured with generalized anxiety. But I don't know, I'll have to look at how the items sort of break down. And we know that ACEs are associated with a lot of bad things related to your health, and you might die 20 years earlier if you've got 6 or more ACEs. That's kind of a lot of years. 60. Whose parents are 60? Like most of you, right? And so we did ask questions about how do you think it shaped your family, right? This is like an open-end question. And these are some of the answers that we got. Not everybody said something. A lot of people said, I don't think it did anything, or I believe it made us stronger. But some people said that it did make things harder for them. It did affect how their family interacted and how they sort of now interact with the world. And ACEs are really bad for birth outcomes, unintended pregnancies, preterm birth, lower birth weight. And so I'm interested in how adverse childhood experiences relate to perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, so depression and anxiety during the perinatal period, so pregnancy and postpartum. And two pathways include systemic inflammation and dysregulation of oxytocin. And sleep, turns out, is this really critical function around systemic inflammation. And so daytime, when you sleep overnight, your levels of inflammatory, pro-inflammatory markers go up. They're sort of taking care of all the things in your body. When you then don't sleep, after it does its thing, those levels go back down. So during the day, you don't have those things sort of circulating around. If your sleep is disrupted, now you've got them circulating around and causing potential health consequences. And so these circulating levels is now potentially contributing to further sleep disturbance and psychological and mental health and health outcomes. And so now looking at how ACEs might prime that pump, so to speak, where people that have a lot of adverse early childhood experiences tend to report worse sleep anyway, right? They might have this underlying factor that then, when they get pregnant, right, everybody, after they have a baby, doesn't sleep that much. Sleep disruptions happen for everybody. Why do some people get super depressed or, develop severe anxiety? And so that generally is what that study is about. And relatedly, how that then leads to the intergenerational transmission of risk. I was pretty proud of this one. I made this. Pretty proud. But that these things lead to adverse birth outcomes and trying to understand how that shapes infant sleep and development. So this is the general model. And this is how we're collecting our data. So 30 weeks, I get them to do a survey and do a sleep diary. And a good proportion of the sample, hopefully, will want to wear one of these sweet sleep trackers. One goes on your mattress. It's creepy. It knows when you're sleeping. It knows. It does your heart rate, it does your breathing, it does your temperature, it does all kinds of things. This ring, I got all my eggs in this ring basket here because it hasn't come yet. I tried this brace, this watch, was not working out. I tried a less expensive watch. I didn't want to buy these and give them away. So I'm hoping that this is going to work out. At 6 weeks, we find out what the birth outcome was. I mean, we can find out a little bit before then, but that's when we do our visit, and we also take a blood sample at that time. And then at 16 weeks, so about 4 months, we again ask them to track their sleep. And so we don't have a ton of data, and right now I've got 25 individuals. This is data on 23 of them because 2 of them, I guess, are in this other data set. But it is similar. So this is the MACEs. So technically the ACEs is in this other data set as well. But we have MACEs, which is an expanded version of the ACEs that looks at a lot of different adverse experiences. And so we're pretty, I think, excited about this data. The WHI is insomnia measure. And so I'm hoping that we'll have some pretty good data. And then related to that, which is the last thing I'll show you, is Bloom. Pretty excited about this one too. this is like an intervention study. So I collaborate with Karina Schreffler, she's an HDFS, and like I just told you, unintended pregnancies are not good, right? And half of like all pregnancies are unintended, which is a crazy statistic. They've tried a lot of things to try to get that number to go down. Doesn't go down. It's weird. People just have unintended pregnancies. They don't know how it happens. But if we can't make the unintended pregnancy go down, maybe the risky things associated with an unintended pregnancy, that we can impact, right? So I want to say the caveat that these are mothers that do intend to keep said baby and carry baby to term, right? They want this baby, or they have decided that they want to keep this baby. I don't think this intervention is going to work for people who do not want to keep their baby. But this is like the overall model that by improving our prenatal attachment, which I'll tell you about in a second, that's going to improve our health practices during that pregnancy and hopefully lead to better outcomes. And so we've got like some pilot data, which is interesting. So we've got these 4 groups. So we did 35 moms as part of this HATCH study. So that's Karina's study. And this is the Doppler, right? I was a little skeptical. This thing, Mira. Yeah, she's not pregnant, sorry. Sorry. Birth announcement. Here, go ahead and put it on your heart.
It'll be really fast now.
Uh-oh, you're not alive. Nervous.
My pregnancy announcement.
Okay, she has a heart, people. She's alive. Right, that using this bad boy to listen to your fetal heart rate, that is the intervention of Doppler only, right? 1 minute a day for 2 weeks. Listen to your baby's heartbeat. My contribution in part was this mindfulness exercises, right? We love mindfulness. Really, these exercises included things like doing some mindful breathing and meditation around who your baby's going to be, what your baby's like, reading to your baby, doing like if you feel your baby kick, responding to the kick by, poking, and then really like trying to attune yourself to this baby. And so this is the HATCH participants, and so they took 35 people from this sample to do this little Bloom, the first iteration of the Bloom intervention. And our unintended pregnancies, where is it? 61%, that's kind of a lot of people that had an unintended pregnancy. And shockingly, so for a while, Doppler only was doing a lot better, but Doppler plus mindfulness now has increased, is like the best. Mindfulness only, did nothing to help prenatal attachment. So this is a score of prenatal attachment. Our control group had even less prenatal attachment over time. So they're reporting that they're feeling less close to their baby. The score goes up to 120. And so this is obviously a small sample, but that's part of the application to get funding to do the intervention further. And so I just want to thank everybody, all of my awesome colleagues that have helped me do all this stuff. And then my lab, my campers, I thought of that earlier. My campers are awesome, and I couldn't do it without them. And then we've got some additional people from other labs that really help us do what we have to do. So thank you for your attention.